All right, so first thing we'll do is we'll look at an example of classes in JavaScript. So we've been using classes a lot in Django. Whether you like it or not, Django itself is an object-oriented web framework, and React kind of has two basic paradigms: a functional paradigm and a class-based paradigm, but both kind of do the same thing. They're implemented differently, but they kind of look very similar. So we'll talk about the specifics of React starting next week, but just as a warm-up, let's talk about classes in JavaScript. So I'm going to create just a basic class. Let's say, so yeah, I'll create a class called dog.js, just because we have to do animals. So can anyone tell me how I can create a dog class in JavaScript?
I had to create a class or
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Can't you just use the class keyword? Class.
You can. Yep. So class.
What was it again? Dog. Class dog. So
yeah.
Capital D, and
Okay.
then open curly brackets.
All right. All right. So I've got a class. So I think this should be okay. So now I have a class. This is kind of a minimal definition. How do I create an instance of a dog?
You would say at the bottom, like dog, lowercase, equals capital DOG,
okay.
Open parenthesis, close parenthesis.
Okay. Is this going to work?
Do we need a let in front of that?
Okay.
Or var or something.
Okay. We'll do let. Anything else?
I think the class needs a constructor. I'm not sure if it does it by default though.
Yeah. So okay. So in here, yes. So you definitely can have a constructor, but this is we'll get into that in a sec. But what about creating an instance? So it is related to the constructor, but we need to do something else if we create an instance.
I think you need the new keyword in JavaScript.
Yeah. So we have to have this new keyword which handles calling the constructor, basically. So if we do this, well, let's see what happens if we don't. Okay. So we get type error, class constructor dog cannot be invoked without new. So we need this new keyword, and if we do that, that works, and we have an instance of dog now. All right, but we're talking about constructors. So what happens if we want to supply the dog with a name? So we want every instance of a dog to have a name, and we can specify that when we instantiate it. So in Python, how do we do this?
In Python, it's the double under init.
Yeah.
But in this case, it'll just be the keyword constructor.
Right. So,
or I guess it's a method.
Yeah. It's a method that you can. So we don't have to have the keyword function here or anything like that. You can just write constructor, and JavaScript knows how to handle this. And the constructor is basically like your init in Python. So we can specify any initial properties we want to have. So let's just say we want a dog to have a name. And then how do I assign this name to the instance?
Would it be this dot name
Yep. Yeah. So this dot name. You do
equals
this,
name?
Yep. So can you tell me about this?
Let's see, what does this mean? I'm not sure. I'm just looking at an example here.
Sure, sure.
Let's see.
So is there an maybe analogy in Python?
It's like, I guess it's like creating, it's like pointing to that particular item.
Yes, exactly. So this is a way of referring to the instance, the dog instance that we have. So it's like self in Python. So if we were creating a class in Python, this would be self.name. Now here in the constructor and in other methods, we don't need to pass in the instance. So we don't have to do this, whatever. We don't do this in JavaScript. So we just pass in whatever property we want, and we can define that here. And now if we create this, we can access the name. So and we can get that property. All right, any questions about that? So we can also do things. This is not maybe so important, but I'll just mention it, that there's getters and setters. So you can do something like get name. And I'm gonna do that. So this does the same thing, but now I'm using a slightly different pattern, or I'm using a getter. So this is a keyword. JavaScript knows how to do this. In Python, we didn't really talk about the property decorator, but this does something similar. So basically we can access name without calling, even though it's a method here, we can access it. So we're keeping this private, we're keeping the actual data private, and we're creating an accessor or a getter here. So, this is not necessarily a common thing you'll see in React, but I just wanted to mention that. So that's another thing.
I'm not sure what get name is actually doing.
Yeah, so let me do. So if I wanted to do something like this. Now it's a little bit clear that this is, this is a property. We want to keep this private. So we don't want consumers of this instance to be able to mess around with this. So we make this private, and then we create a getter, which is designed to access. So it provides a level of indirection. So we want to keep this private, and if you want to access it, you have to go through this method.
Thank you.
We could also do something like, not to be confusing, but get name. So this is just a normal method. this is a keyword, get space, and then the name of the function. So this is a special thing in JavaScript. This is just a normal method, but we could also do something very similar. Difference is we have to call it as a function, whereas here we can like pretend that it's a property name. So these are both returning the same thing, but this is the normal method. We can also do, we can use arrow functions here. So get name, and let me do. And I'll just change this to. So this will do the same thing. Okay.
Chad, can you remind me, does the underscore actually have an effect, or is it just a like a convention?
There is a new, I think, I haven't messed around with it, but I think in a newer version of JavaScript, like very recent, they actually added support for private methods, but I haven't really played around with it, but I believe that that's a feature that exists in JavaScript now. All right, so we can have a class with methods. What about inheritance? So one thing I'm going to do here, so imports are kind of a pain in JavaScript because there are two systems. There's the common JS system, and then there's the newer one. And we'll use it's a little bit of a pain, but I'm going to. You can basically ignore this because we won't have to worry about it when we get to React. But I'm going to add. So instead of .js, it'll be .mjs. So it will treat it as a module, which will allow it to be imported. And I'm going to create another. Okay, so I have a dog and I have an animal. Let's go ahead and create the animal class first. Let's see. Jared, can you walk me through creating an animal class?
So the class keyword.
Okay.
And then animal. And the curly brace. And then if we have any sort of constructor that we want to give it like a name or a species.
Okay. We'll do something like all right, and how about a method?
Okay, we could do like get alive.
Okay.
Get is
You get-
alive.
Let's do, yeah, let's do, okay, yeah, that's fine. So get. Let me mark this. All right. And I have, okay, so I have, let's say a class here. And then I want dog to inherit from animal. I'm gonna have to do a few things.
Really import.
Okay, so I'm gonna have to import it. That's one. How can I just import? So I'll write this out. So import's a little different than Python. So we start with import and then what we want to import, and then a string, which is the path, and you don't need the file extension. So from the same directory, these are at the same level. So we import it dot slash and then the name of the file, and you don't need the extension. I'm getting sorry. So import and then from import the thing you want and then from the place where you want it. Okay, so let's say I have this imported now. So how do I make dog inherit from animal? So you use the, and yeah, if this were Python, you do something like animal, right? But that's not how it works. The syntax is a little different. So we use the extends keyword. So extends and then animal. So one quirk or difference, not really a quirk, but one difference between Python and JavaScript is that you can't do multiple inheritance in JavaScript. So dog extends animal, and that's it. So let's try running dog now. And we get an error here. So can I find module dog? Wait, what? That should be happening.
You changed the extension to MGS.
Oh, thank you. Okay, so now we should also have the same error, but from somewhere else. So can't find the animal. Can I find module whatever animal imported from dog? So we have the import statement up here, but with JavaScript, you can't just import, you have to explicitly export from the source file as well. So we can do export, and there are a few things to do. The typical thing to do in React, because there's one class per file, so you can use default, export, default, and then what you want to export. So in animal, we're explicitly exporting animal, and default basically means this is the only thing. It's not strictly speaking, but this basically means we just want to assume that the animal is being exported, like the only export. So now if we import animal here, let's see. Importing it here, extending it. Okay, I might have to specify the file extension if I'm doing. Okay, sorry. So this, you don't need to worry about this in React, but this is just to get this toy example working. So we're importing here, and now we get a different error. So it's throwing on this .pet name right here. So I'm importing animal successfully. I create an instance, the constructor gets called, and then it throws an error here when the constructor gets called. It's telling me it's a reference error, must call super constructor in derived class before accessing this or returning from derived constructor. So that might not be entirely clear. But in Python, when you inherit from a parent class, you can optionally call super, right? So you can call the constructor of the parent class with super, and then you'll get everything in the init basically. Here in JavaScript, you have to do that basically, and do that by calling super, and that's it. So because I'm inheriting from animal, I call super before I can start using this. And now everything works. And we should also be able to get dog dot is alive. So Fluffy is alive. So just couple things are different from Python. One, we have to explicitly export before we can import, and then we import using a string which has the file path. And if this were in another folder, it would be /myfolder/animal. And then when we inherit, we use extends. So dog extends animal. There's no multiple inheritance in JavaScript. And when we call the constructor of the class that's inheriting, you have to call super before you can do anything else. And once you do that, everything else works as expected.
Chad, can you go back to the animal class real quick?
Yeah.
What's the difference? I see export default animal. What's
Yeah.
module.exports?
Yeah, so that's just an older, there are two kind of systems that exist for handling imports and exports. The older one is called common JS. And the newer one, I forget what it's called, if it has a specific name, but we'll be using the newer one in React, which is this one. You should also just be able to do this. Let's see, yeah, we'll stick with this because this is what React does. Okay, so that's the basics of classes, just a kind of a review classes in JavaScript. Let's do some newer features of JavaScript that get used in React. So one of them is basically two things, not that complicated, but okay, so one of them is the spread operator. So the spread operator in JavaScript is like the asterisk args in Python. So it's just a way of, let's say we have an array. So So I have an array. And if I want to call a function, so I'll write a function here. So takes 4 parameters. I can call the function my func. I can call it with my array. So I use the spread operator, which is ... and it takes that, you know, it's a structure, and it kind of pulls out all the individual elements. So I can pass them in individually as parameters. So 1 is A, 2 is B. So it's convenient if you have, oops. So these are all separate. And notice the difference if I do right. So here, my array is actually it's actually an array, and here it's just individual values. So that's one thing. It's, you know, it's like Python with args. You can pass in basically any number. You don't have to specifically pull out all of the values and then pass them in individually. So it's, you know, it's a convenience, but it's something that React does.
Is there an equivalent to like the double asterisk, where it'd be like unpacking an object?
Yeah, so there's, yes, basically yes. So there's something called destructuring. So if we have, let's see. Don't need quotes here. And so I could get the value of Apple by doing this. So let's say, let me comment out these. All right, so I have an object with a bunch of key value pairs, and then I can access it directly. So my object dot whatever. You can also use destructuring. So let and here it's an object. So it's object destructuring. And this will be so if you use destructuring, you can refer directly to the keys here. So in this case, Apple. And if we console log, that's an apple. So we're basically saying, take my object, and then it's going to assign as a variable name, basically directly here. There's another alternative or variation, whereas let's say I don't want this to be called Apple. I want to give it a name maybe that's more appropriate for the context I'm using it. So I can do that. And I get the same thing there. So the syntax for an object for an object is use the curly brackets, and then you pass in the name of the key that you want specifically. So it just, you know, you don't have to access it over here. And if you want to simultaneously access it and then change the name of the variable, you can do it like this. The same, you can also use destructuring on arrays. I'm gonna comment that back in. So my array, I'm gonna do let two. You can also simultaneously assign. So 1, so we've taken this array of elements, which has 4 members, and we've basically assigned each one of them a variable name that we can access over here. You could also do so there's so here is the spread. So this is the spread operator, ... The same operator can be used in a different way here. It's called rest, basically. ... So I can either assign a name to all of them, but let's just say, maybe I only care about this one or whatever, or I want to, for whatever reason, you can use the spread operator and it will take everything else in the array and assign it to this variable here. So I can still access 1 as an individual value. So I can grab the first one, and then others is everything else. So those are really, I think, the 2 basic, in terms of the JavaScript you need to know to use React effectively, learning or, refreshing yourself on how classes work in JavaScript, and then the destructuring and spread operator. Any questions about that? Okay, so I'm gonna do an example now. So this is kind of based on the challenge for today. So there are 2 challenges. So this is the one you need to do first. Ticketmaster is if you get done with this, you want to do something else. I'll talk about that in a sec. But Proto React, we're basically going to build a website in a way that's similar to how React does it, at least superficially. So I'm gonna, just because there's some setup that's required in order to get all this working, I'm gonna go ahead and clone this down. All right. I'll keep those. Okay, so here, there's some additional configuration. So this will look, more like what a React project looks like. So you'll have a source file, which will be like the main code that you write. There's a build file, which is basically going to have your deployment files in it. And then there's some configuration. You don't really need to worry about this, but this is all set up for you here. And React will, there's something called Create React App, which is like Django's create project and create app. So it will, when you initially create a React project, all of the boilerplate will be there for you. So that's kind of what this is mimicking. And then this package.json, we've got some stuff here. So the reason to use Webpack is that you can really only serve up one file at the end of the day. So it will combine everything that we write. So our real application, which is going to have lots of different folders and files to keep things organized, Webpack will take all of that and bundle it together in one file. So that's why that's there. The source file. So I'm going to go ahead and just, first off, I'm going to install everything. So I have a package.json, and this has all of the dependencies. In this case, they're just development dependencies. So I'm going to install everything by running npm install. And that's going to create a node modules folder here, which I don't really need to worry about, but it's got all of the code that I need from my third-party dependencies. And then once I have that going, if I look in the package.json, I have the scripts, and then I'm going to run npm run. And then if you run npm run, that will give you access to the scripts. So in this case, build, npm run build. You don't need to memorize these details. This is just for the challenge. And a whole bunch of stuff. Webpack's going to do its thing. And then here in the build folder, it's going to create a JavaScript file, which we are importing here in the script tag in our index.html. And you don't need to, this is all of the Webpack magic. So if you want to confuse yourself, you can spend some time looking at that. And then once we have that, we can actually run it. So I'm going to use live server. I'm going to run it with live server. And now this application is running. Obviously, we don't have anything because we haven't written anything. But this is our main HTML file. So if we look at our index.html, we have this one div, which is preloaded in there. And this is, when we get to React, you'll see that something similar, React does something similar. So we have this kind of like root element, which has an ID of a root. And then if we go into our source folder, which is where we're going to be actually writing the code for our application, we have an index.js, which is going to be like the main entry point for our code. So the main entry point for our code is going to be index.js. And notice here, so the window, when the window loads, the JavaScript file will be executed. And it's going to call all this stuff, this render method, and the render method is going to grab that root element we have from our HTML document. And then it's going to set the inner HTML to whatever this is. And we haven't written this yet, so this doesn't exist, but we'll be writing that. So this React DOM class is basically everything that you write. You're going to write a bunch of different classes. They're going to represent components. And the component is just like a piece of a web page, like a nav bar or a form or a button or a footer or whatever. You can kind of break it up as small or large as you like. But this is going to be the main entry point, and we're gonna render a bunch of other components, and those components, they can be nested as deeply as you like, but at the end of the day, it's all going to get turned into one thing here. And this is like the contents of our application. It's going to get inserted into that root div of the index.html. So our entire application is going to end up showing up right here. And then, yeah, styles, you're free to add. So I'm going to go ahead and just add, just so we know that this is working. Background color, do something dark salmon. And because I'm using Webpack to build, I'm going to need to rerun. If I change anything, I'm going to have to rebuild that file. So I'm going to run npm run build again. It's going to do its thing. And because I have live server, I'm using live server, it's based on this. So it's going to update. So I don't need to like restart the server every time, but every time I change, I'll have to rerun npm run build. So now I know that everything's hooked up and working. We can start writing components. So I'm in here in the source folder. I'm going to create another folder called components. This is a common thing you'll do in React. Okay, and the first component, I'm gonna, let's just say I'm gonna call this like the main page. All right, so I'm gonna create a main page component, and I'm going to pass that in here. So my React DOM class, it accepts something, which is going to be a child component. So it'll be another class. And then it's going to call the render method on this class that we're passing in. So here's a render method here. All of these classes will have render methods. I'm going to call this render method. So I know that when I'm creating this main page, I'm going to have a render method. So let's make this class. And I'll create a constructor. And just to follow the pattern, just so we can keep embedding these, I'm going to make sure that it has a child component and this dot. And I know that I'm going to need a render method. And my render method is going to have to return it's going to have to return some HTML. So I'm going to use parentheses in case I want to have a multi-line return statement. So just to get started, I'm going to do, so this is kind of a very janky version of React, just to get you thinking in terms of making classes and then assembling them together to create a web page. So we're basically just going to use strings here. React obviously is more sophisticated than this. But here I'm going to do And I'm going to do it like this. Okay, so we don't have, actually, okay, I'll skip this part for now. Okay, so I have oh, you guys got to call me on that doing Python. All right, so I've got this main page class, and I want to insert that into here. So we're gonna have to pass it in an instance, and it's gonna call the render method. So I'm gonna need to import main page into index. So I can do that here. Import components. So it's in the components folder. So I have to go into components and then main page. I've got components, main page, and then I can actually pass that in here. So React DOM, when I create this instance, it accepts the child, and I want the child, this child to be main page. And then I'm imported it here, which means I need to export it here. So export default main page. And I'm actually going to cheat a little bit. So, I'm trying to make this as like React as possible without it being React. So I'm going to export just the instance of main page. So just pay attention to that as you're doing the challenge. Make sure you're exporting the instance, because it's going to call the render method, which means you're going to have an instance available. All right, so I'm going to try loading that now. So I'm going to run npm run build. Okay, and let's see. So that worked. This is now the main container that I've added. And if I look here, I have a div with an ID of main. So I'm going to go into the CSS just to make this more obvious. So I gave it an ID of main. And I'm going to do and I'll give it a border. So I'm going to rebuild. And here's the main container now for the app. So looking at the index.html again, I have this React DOM element, which is going to be rendered. The render method is going to grab the root of the HTML, which is right here. And it's going to insert, whatever the child's render method does. So here's the child main page. This is an instance of main page, because I'm exporting the instance using new. This has a render method which returns, a string which is HTML. So ultimately, the HTML here is getting inserted into the root here. We can also continue this process. So from main page, let's say I want main page to have a nav bar. So what we can do here is, here's the main container, and I'm going to call this .child .render here. And I'm going to create another component, which is going to be the nav bar. So I'm going to go into source components, create another file. This will be a class. I'm going to call it constructor. And then I need a render method. I need to return something. And that something is basically going to be HTML. I'm also going to export this. And I'm going to export an instance. And then main page needs to take an instance. I'm going to have to import nav bar from. So I didn't have to go into components because these are sisters, they're at the same level. So from nav bar and then nav bar. So nav bar will get rendered right in here. So inside of this div. So whatever we return from nav bar's render is going to show up right here inside of this component. And then this component is going to show up inside of this component. And you can do that, as many times as you want. So here I'm going to return I'll give it an ID. I'm going to build this now. Go in here. I can see that I have the nav bar element now included in there. So just to make what's happening clear, I'm going to go into the CSS file and add nav. I don't know if dashed is a thing, but so I have to rebuild it. And so I have the nav bar now included right there. So you're not limited to just the render function. So let's say I want to call a function that will return some nav elements. Let's just say, so get. This would be a good candidate for yet another component, but I'm just going to show you that you can do this kind of thing here. So const. Contact. And I can use map, so I can map over these. Return and map or take a callback. so I can pass it. It's going to take a callback, and that callback is going to get a parameter, and that parameter is going to represent each one of these things. So and I'm going to return some HTML here. Interpolation. I think that should work. And then here, I'm going to call this function right here. So let's see if that works. So obviously this is terrible, but this does work. So just so this is the main challenge for today. I know it's kind of confusing, and don't get too hung up on the details. This is just something that I made up to mimic React, so don't get too hung up on the details. But this is the basic idea here, where you have this React DOM element, which is a component which calls a child's render. You can create more components here. They also can render other components and so on. So that's the basic idea. And you're not limited to just the render method. You could write other methods that do other things. So that is that's basically it for this. And the README explains some of this. So if you have questions about any of that, please let me know. And if you get done with that, it's open-ended, so you could spend as much or as little time on that as you like. And if you want something else to work on, there's Ticketmaster. I would suggest working with a partner for Ticketmaster. So you would probably use Django for this, unless you wanted to do something else, but you probably use Django for this. And Ticketmaster is an example of, it's a free third-party API, but it's a real API, and trying to get data out of it is a pain because there's a ton of data and it's hard to figure out. So if you want an exercise in trying to deal with a real complicated JSON data structure and pull things out and use it in your application, then I would suggest doing this. But it can be frustrating, and I think it's helpful to have to work with someone else. So entirely optional, but yeah. Are there any questions about any of that? And then, sorry, also at 10, I'll send a reminder. At 10, Jared's going to come in. So if you have questions about, he's going to talk about his job search process. So if you have questions, you can be thinking of those.